1 million ostriches, not penned in farms, not displayed in zoos, but released into the wild savanna of Burkina Faso. It sounded absurd. Birds in place of bullets, feathers instead of fertilizer. Yet for Ibrahim Traoré, it was no absurdity. It was defiance. In a land where 35% of harvests were lost each year to locusts and rodents, these towering birds became more than creatures. They became soldiers without rifles, doctors without stethoscopes, banners without cloth. Their thunderous steps promised to guard the soil, feed the hungry, and challenge the very logic of dependency. Picture it. Villagers gathering as convoys opened their gates, dust clouds rising, children cheering, farmers praying, soldiers taking notes instead of aim. A nation dared to wager its future not on chemicals imported from abroad, but on wings beating across its own horizon. Yet the question lingers. Could 1 million ostriches transform destiny or unleash chaos? Do not look away. What you are about to hear is more than an experiment. It is a battle for dignity, for survival, for sovereignty. Stay with us, subscribe now, and follow as we enter the heart of this audacious gamble. In the spring of Traoré's second year in power, the savannah of Burkina Faso witnessed a spectacle unlike anything recorded in its long memory. Convoys rumbled through the parched land, not laden with soldiers or ammunition, but with cages, hundreds of cages, each holding a juvenile ostrich. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned a horizon they had never known. Their wings were clipped for transport, but their legs, the most powerful in the animal kingdom, were restless with potential. When the gates opened, the desert floor shook. Clouds of dust rose as flocks burst forth, sprinting into freedom. Farmers gasped, children laughed, soldiers scribbled notes while struggling to contain the surge. In less than 12 months, over 1 million ostriches would be released, not behind fences, not on private farms, but into the wild itself. The savannah was to be their sanctuary. In return, they would become guardians of the land. Government officials explained with simple conviction, each ostrich consumes dozens of kilograms of insects, snakes, scorpions, and rodents every year. Where pesticides faltered and foreign shipments arrived too late, wings and beaks would prevail. These are not just birds, declared one minister. They are soldiers in the war against hunger. For a nation where up to 35% of harvests were lost annually to pests, the idea resonated like rain on thirsty soil. Locusts had swept fields bare. Rodents gnawed through stores of grain. Snakes slithered into huts, threatening children's sleep. Now, the government promised, the balance would shift. The desert, once a battlefield of survival, would host an army bred by nature itself. The symbolism was unmistakable. For decades, Burkina Faso had relied on shipments of chemicals and fertilizers from Europe, costly, delayed, and often tied to political conditions. Traoré rejected that chain. He declared that sovereignty was not only about borders and armies, but about biology itself. The ostrich, one advisor said, is our declaration of independence. It is born here, it survives here, it serves our people here. The release was breathtaking in both scale and audacity. Villagers gathered at the edge of the desert, eyes wide as cages swung open. Children chased the birds, laughing at their impossible speed. Farmers whispered prayers that these ungainly giants might shield their crops. Soldiers stood back, rifles slung, notebooks ready. A teacher in Zainor remarked, "It was as if the earth itself was moving." The birds came like a storm, and for the first time in many seasons I felt hope. Markets in Ouagadougou buzzed with speculation. Vendors wondered when ostrich eggs, each the weight of 20 chicken eggs, might grace family tables. Housewives imagined a single omelet feeding an entire wedding. Youths joked about feasts so large they could never finish them. Yet beneath the humor lay something more serious. The first stirrings of belief that hunger might finally be driven from their homes by wings, not aid convoys. Still, unease shadowed the euphoria. Elders remembered old stories warning of the dangers of bending nature too far. "The ostrich is powerful," one said gravely. "But power does not come without consequence." Some worried the birds might trample fields as easily as they devoured pests. Others asked whether 1,000,000 giants could truly be managed once set free. The government reassured citizens. Releases would be staged, monitored, and studied carefully. Harvest programs were already being designed to keep populations balanced. "We do not throw birds to the wind," officials insisted. "We shape destiny with our own hands." Yet the paradox remained. Why ostriches? Why not imported technology, genetically modified seeds, or modern laboratories? Why gamble on birds taller than men? The answer lay deeper. Ostriches embodied resilience. They required little water, survived harsh heat, and devoured threats without cost to the soil. Their meat was lean, their eggs rich in protein, their hides commercially valuable. They were, in the words of one scientist, a biological army that multiplies itself. It was an audacious vision: to fight hunger, protect crops, and create wealth through the wings of nature. Supporters hailed it as genius, a step away from dependency and towards dignity. Critics scoffed, calling it reckless, even medieval. Yet the die was cast. Trucks rolled, gates opened, and 1,000,000 ostriches thundered into the desert. The people watched. The world watched. And a question began to echo from village huts to international capitals. Could 1,000,000 wings truly protect a nation, or would they one day bring it to its knees? At first, the mood was electric. In villages near Kaya, children chased the giant birds in awe, their laughter rising like drums across the savannah. At night, families whispered that the fields felt quieter, that the usual rustle of rodents and snakes had been replaced by the heavy steps of ostriches patrolling the dark. In Ouagadougou's markets, vendors began speculating about the day when ostrich eggs, each nearly 3 pounds, would become staples on family tables. Housewives spoke of feeding entire families with a single egg, while young men joked that an omelet from Traoré's birds could serve an entire wedding. There were stories of relief. Issa, a farmer from Koudougou, told neighbors that for years his grain had been stolen by rats before harvest. Now the rats were gone. He had seen an ostrich chase them at night, faster than any dog. "I lost almost nothing this season," he said proudly. In the South, clinics reported fewer scorpion stings and snake bite cases. Teachers noticed children coming to class more regularly, parents believing it was because pests had vanished from their homes. For the first time in decades, families dared to imagine a different harvest, one defended not by chemicals, but by nature itself. The government pointed to statistics. Test regions showed a 12% rise in agricultural output after the releases. It was no revolution, but in a land where small margins meant the difference between hunger and survival, it felt like a miracle. Newspapers carried headlines proclaiming that the ostrich had joined the fight against hunger. Soldiers overseeing the releases admitted they were astonished. The birds were so strong that even trucks strained to contain them once the gates swung open. But beneath the excitement, shadows crept in. Farmers in the Central Plateau began noticing strange signs: fences broken, seedlings crushed, fields scarred with tracks far too large for goats or cattle. In Koudougou, a village awoke to find half its maize trampled by a passing flock. "It was like a storm had struck us," one farmer lamented. "The birds were so many we could not chase them. They ran straight through our fields, and when they left, our harvest was ruined." Herders reported that ostriches were harassing their livestock. Goats fled from water holes when the towering birds arrived. A boy tending calves described an ostrich kicking one so hard it collapsed. Along the Nambe River, fishermen worried the birds might disturb banks and nesting grounds. The most alarming claims came from Bobo Dioulasso, where villagers swore ostriches had raided chicken coops, crushing smaller birds beneath their massive feet. Photographs spread on WhatsApp. Dead hens in the dust, feathers scattered, a towering shadow in the background. Some dismissed the images as fake, but the fear they sparked was undeniable. Then came the thunderclap, a leaked government report obtained by a local journalist admitting to unintended consequences of the ostrich program. The document acknowledged crop damage, harassment of livestock, and even injuries to villagers. It warned that unless strict measures were taken, ostrich populations could destabilize rural livelihoods and erode trust in the state itself. International media seized the story. Headlines mocked the experiment as a folly of youthful leadership. European environmental groups declared, "This is ecological roulette." Analysts in Western capitals dismissed it as a desperate stunt, a medieval solution in an age of biotechnology. On social media, critics circulated satirical memes of ostriches trampling fences, captioned with barbed remarks about African solutions. Inside Burkina Faso, whispers grew louder. In Ouagadougou's markets, where traders once joked about ostrich omelets, voices now carried unease. "We asked for protection," one vendor muttered bitterly. "But what if we have unleashed something worse than the pest?" Elders recalled ancestral warnings. When man seeks to master nature with arrogance, nature always answers back. The nation found itself suspended between awe and anxiety. On one side, families who ate better and slept without fear of snakes. On the other, farmers watching crops flattened and herders counting wounded animals. What had begun as a miracle now threatened to tip into menace. All eyes turned to the presidency. Would Ibrahim Traoré retreat, admitting failure? Would he cage the birds he had unleashed, bowing to international pressure? Or would he gamble again, turning crisis into opportunity? And so the cliffhanger sharpened. Had Traoré's million-strong ostrich army become saviors or saboteurs, and what daring move would he make next? The paradox deepened as weeks turned into months. On the surface, the ostriches delivered visible benefits. In test regions, the Ministry of Agriculture proudly reported a 12% increase in crop yields after the first release. Families in villages long haunted by rodents now harvested fuller baskets. Clinics in the south noted fewer cases of scorpion stings and snake bites, though doctors cautioned it was too early to prove a direct link. Parents swore their children no longer woke in the night scratching from insect bites. Teachers in rural schools saw attendance rise, believing healthier diets were already making a difference. Protein, once a scarce dream in Burkina Faso's countryside, began to enter daily life. Ostrich eggs, equivalent to 20 chicken eggs, found their way into community celebrations. Mothers marveled at feeding all their children with a single giant egg. Markets whispered of dishes yet to come, grilled ostrich steaks, soups richer than any seen before. For many, the presence of the birds was no longer abstract. It was nourishment, it was hope. Politically, the effects were immediate. Traoré, the young leader who had dared to bet on nature itself, now stood at the center of heated debate. Supporters called him a visionary, praising him for breaking the chains of dependency. For decades, pesticides and fertilizers had been imported from Europe, expensive, unreliable, and tied to political strings. By turning to a creature native to the land, Traoré framed sovereignty not only as a question of borders, but of biology. "We will not bow to foreign corporations selling us poison," he declared in a speech. "We will walk with our own birds, eat from our own land, and sell with our own hands." The symbolism resonated deeply. The ostrich became a living emblem of self-reliance. Farmers saw themselves reflected in its resilience, surviving on little water, enduring searing heat, facing predators with speed and strength. Artisans began to dream of industries built around its hides and feathers. Musicians sang of wings that carried dignity across the savannah. The bird was no longer simply a solution. It was a metaphor for an entire generation's defiance. But critics within the country refused to be silent. Cattle herders complained of ostriches driving goats away from scarce watering holes. Farmers in the Central Plateau lamented flattened seedlings. Villagers in Bobo Dioulasso recounted flocks storming chicken coops, leaving feathers and broken cages in their wake. To them, the ostriches were not saviors but storms, indifferent, uncontrollable, and devastating. The leaked government report added fuel to their anger. It admitted to crop damage, livestock harassment, and even human injuries. Opposition voices seized on it as evidence of recklessness. "What good is dignity?" one elder asked, "if it tramples the very food we plant?" The rift between urban optimism and rural anxiety widened. In Ouagadougou, people celebrated the idea of self-reliance. In villages, some questioned whether the gamble would undo the fragile balance between man and land. The paradox pressed on Traoré's leadership. He could not simply retreat. Caging the ostriches would symbolize surrender. Nor could he ignore the growing unrest. Instead, he doubled down, presenting the second stage of his program, the Circle of Ostriches. In this model, the birds would first serve as living pest control, but they would not roam unchecked forever. They would be harvested in cycles, processed into meat, eggs, leather, and exports. In the government's vision, nature itself would be harnessed into a renewable economy. The first results startled even skeptics. Within a year of harvest, 20,000 tons of ostrich meat were distributed to schools, hospitals, and military barracks. Children who once ate beans day after day now tasted meat twice in a week. Housewives spoke of seeing their children stronger, smiling, thriving. Restaurants experimented with new recipes. Omelets the size of frying pans, steaks stretching across entire plates. Artisans worked with ostrich hides, producing belts and shoes sold abroad. By the end of the second year, exports had earned over $50 million. Within another year, that figure soared to $120 million. The ostrich, once mocked as an absurd gamble, had become an economic engine. It diversified an economy long tied to gold and cotton. It provided jobs, food, and dignity. It offered a new story to tell the world. One in which African solutions came not from laboratories abroad, but from the soil beneath their own feet. Traoré's gamble transformed into a rallying cry, a proof point that African leadership could innovate on its own terms, even if the path seemed strange to outsiders. Yet with every success came unease. Environmentalists within Burkina Faso warned of overexploitation. Would the drive for export repeat the same mistakes of resource extraction that had drained Africa's wealth for centuries? Elders cautioned that nature's gifts, if overused, could vanish as quickly as they appeared. Herders feared that wild instincts would never be tamed, that ostriches would always threaten livestock. And in every conversation, one haunting truth remained. 1 million birds are not easily controlled once they roam free. The nation stood at a crossroads, celebrating fuller stomachs and fatter markets, yet haunted by whispers of ecological chaos. Farmers, traders, and politicians all asked the same question, though in different words. Were the ostriches building the foundations of sovereignty, or laying the seeds of the next crisis? Burkina Faso's ostrich gamble did not stay confined within its borders. As dust clouds rose over the savannah, neighbors looked on with a mix of fascination and caution. Mali and Niger dispatched agricultural experts to observe the experiment firsthand. Chad sent a delegation to study whether ostriches could survive in its own arid north. Ghana, further south, enrolled agricultural students in field visits, eager to understand how a bird once dismissed as exotic might become a tool for survival. Regional media buzzed with speculation. Could the Sahel, long branded in global headlines as a corridor of crisis, now become a laboratory of resilience? Some commentators hailed Burkina Faso's move as the birth of an indigenous ecological model. If ostriches could protect harvests in one landlocked nation, why not guinea fowl in Niger, camels in Chad, or other native species across the belt of desert and savanna? For the first time in years, the conversation in West Africa was not about aid packages or foreign interventions, but about homegrown solutions shaped by the land itself. Internationally, however, the response was sharper, even scornful. European environmental groups condemned the mass release, calling it ecological roulette. Reports warned that altering ecosystems with 1 million large birds could cause irreversible damage. Animal welfare organizations criticized the later harvest cycles as cruel, branding the so-called Circle of Ostriches a veiled form of industrial farming. Western analysts dismissed the program as a medieval stunt in the age of biotechnology. Headlines mocked the idea that wings could replace science, portraying Traoré as reckless, desperate for attention. And yet, beyond the criticism lay an undeniable shift. Aid organizations accustomed to dictating terms found themselves challenged. Conferences in Addis Ababa, Dakar, and even New York cited Burkina Faso's ostriches as proof that African nations could carve paths outside frameworks designed abroad. The story forced uncomfortable questions. If one of the poorest nations on Earth could innovate through nature, what did that say about the billions poured into aid programs that often yielded little lasting change? Within the region, whispers of cooperation grew louder. Leaders and ministers floated the idea that shared ecological solutions could unite the Sahel. In one editorial, a Malian journalist wrote, "For decades we have begged separately. What if we now dared to build together? What if ostriches became not just Burkina's guardians, but the first wing beats of a Sahel alliance?" It was a vision that stirred both pride and unease. Pride, because it promised solidarity and independence. Unease, because it raised the stakes. One experiment's failure could ripple across borders, discrediting not only a government, but an entire region's hope. And so, as conferences debated and capitals argued, the question sharpened again. Could a flock of birds truly unite a region? And could even a Sahel alliance withstand the advancing storms of climate change? When criticism grew loud and fears spread across the countryside, many expected Ibrahim Traoré to retreat. 1 million ostriches in the wild, critics argued, was already chaos enough. Yet instead of stepping back, he unveiled the second stage of the gamble, a design hidden until the time was right. He called it l'era de lotus, the Circle of Ostriches. The logic was bold yet disarmingly simple. The birds were never meant to roam unchecked forever. From the beginning, the plan envisioned a cycle: release, growth, harvest, redistribution. Ostriches would first serve as living pest control, but then they would be captured in organized drives, processed, and transformed into food, leather, and export commodities. In this way, nature would not spiral out of control. It would be harnessed into a renewable economy. The results astonished even skeptics. Within the first harvest year, more than 20,000 tons of ostrich meat were delivered to schools, hospitals, and military barracks. For children who had never eaten meat twice in a week, ostrich stew became a revelation. Eggs, equivalent to 20 chickens each, were distributed to rural families, filling stomachs long accustomed only to millet and beans. In city restaurants, chefs experimented: omelets larger than frying pans, grilled steaks bigger than dinner plates. Suddenly, what had been a source of fear became a symbol of abundance. Artisans in local workshops began crafting belts, shoes, and handbags from ostrich hides, prized for their strength and distinctive texture. Exports followed. By the end of the second year, Burkina Faso earned over $50 million in ostrich-related trade. A year later, that figure had surged to $120 million. A program once mocked as absurd was now generating revenue rivaling traditional exports like cotton. The transformation spilled into culture. In Ouagadougou, a young chef named Aminata made Traoré's ostrich steak, the signature dish of her small restaurant, drawing queues down the street. Children decorated eggshells as keepsakes for school celebrations. Musicians wrote songs blending humor with pride. The ostrich runs fast, and so do we. For many, eating ostrich was no longer only about nutrition. It was about identity, about tasting freedom. Yet unease lingered. Environmentalists warned that relying too heavily on one species risked repeating old mistakes: overexploitation, ecological imbalance, vulnerability to disease. Herders worried the birds would never truly be domesticated, that wild instincts would always threaten livestock. Even supporters admitted a silent fear. What if climate change, already pushing desert winds deeper into farmland, turned the savanna hostile? What if drought or disease thinned the very flocks that now sustained national pride? The ostrich had become a mirror of Burkina Faso itself, bold, unyielding, yet vulnerable to forces beyond its control. Families ate better, markets thrived, exports grew, but sovereignty tied to the survival of a single bird carried risk as well as promise. And so the question sharpened once more. Had Burkina Faso found a renewable circle of strength, or had it bound its future to wings that could one day vanish on the desert wind? As the dust of 1,000,000 ostriches settles across the savanna, Burkina Faso stands at a turning point. What began as an experiment has grown into something far larger, a redefinition of sovereignty itself. The birds have given protein where there was hunger, income where there was scarcity, and pride where there was dependency. They have filled stomachs and inspired songs, turned markets into workshops of leather and kitchens into theaters of abundance. Yet the deeper legacy lies not in the eggs or the exports, but in the symbolism. For decades, Africa's story was written in the language of dependency. Fertilizers borrowed, technologies imported, aid delivered with strings attached. The ostriches broke that script. They reminded the world that solutions can be born from within, shaped by the land, guided by the people themselves. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was sovereignty. History offers parallels. In the United States, victory gardens fed millions during war. In post-war Japan, rice cultivation underpinned recovery. For Burkina Faso, perhaps the ostrich is its victory garden, its rice field, its emblem of resilience. And through it, a new chapter of African leadership emerges, not one defined by external dictates, but by boldness, creativity, and risk undertaken on African soil. At the regional level, the ripple effect is undeniable. Mali, Niger, Chad, and Ghana are watching closely. If ecological solutions can be shared across borders, then the wings of the ostrich may yet inspire a Sahel alliance, a coalition built not on dependency, but on common resilience. For the first time in decades, the Sahel is exporting not desperation, but innovation. Yet the warning is clear. Nature gives, but it also takes away. Drought, disease, or shifting markets could fracture the circle. Sovereignty cannot rest on wings alone. It must be built piece by piece, through schools, clinics, balanced ecosystems, and leaders who understand both the power and the limits of audacity. That is the true test of African leadership, to turn bold experiments into lasting foundations. If this story stirred your sense of dignity, do not let it fade. Subscribe, share, and add your voice, because Africa's story is still being written, and the next chapter may depend on how we choose to walk together.